facetiously titled Building Information Empires, right? And the section of the talk is going to be in 3 parts. There's going to be a building part, an information part, and an empire part. And I think that it is something that's going to be really relevant and useful for all of us. And the general framework for thinking about this entire talk is I want to give you a new lens through which you can look at the world. And some of you might already have this lens, and I want to polish that lens for you so that that lens becomes more clear and more powerful for you. So let's start with a short story. One of my favorite authors is this guy called David Foster Wallace. And David Foster Wallace is this great fiction writer. He writes postmodern fiction, but he also gives speeches. So one of the speeches he gave was in Kenyon College, and he told a short story that I think has profound influence in shaping how we think. The story goes something like this. There are 2 fish swimming along the sea, and they're young fish, they're enjoying the waves. And along the other side comes an older fish. The older fish says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And one of the fish says, "Oh, it's good." And the fish swims past and they keep swimming. And then a few seconds later, one young fish looks at the other fish and says, "What's water?" So that's the question I want to start the presentation with, right? For fish, water is the medium through which they live, right? It is literally the thing they breathe in and out every single time they take a breath, and it is also the thing that controls their entire environment. And yet for most fish, I bet that they don't really understand what water is. Well, we humans are not very different. We have our own water, and that water is fundamentally information, right? It is information that we're receiving through our ears, eyes, and nose, and our bodily sensations, and it is allowing us to perceive this world around us. But there's a problem, right? The problem is that the information, for the most part, for us, is invisible, right? We don't actually actively perceive what exactly is the environment telling us, and how is that changing how we think. But I'd argue that living here in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, that information is actually changing us in very profound ways. And so, here at the Thiel Summit, we're gathered as really young and really ambitious people, right? And some of us have amazing, records of doing great stuff already, and we want to continue to do great stuff. But we should be very careful of the information we consume and how that influences how we think. So here's an example, right? What's the recent most big news event you've heard about? It's probably one of these 2 things, right? The first, WhatsApp gets acquired by Facebook for something like some ridiculous sum of money, and then Uber, as of 2 days ago, has a $17, $18 valuation, right? That changes and distorts how we perceive the world, right? Instead of caring about what's happening in Syria right now, right? Most of us, when we heard about the Uber valuation, is what are we doing, right? How can we create something that also has similarly ridiculously outsized returns? This is symptomatic of a deeper, endemic problem. And the problem, in order to see the problem, we have to start with this gentleman. So does anyone know who this guy is? Chomsky. So this is Noah Chomsky, right? He was a linguist at MIT, and he was also famous for writing about the foreign policy decisions of the United States. And also, he exposes several essays and speeches on understanding power, right? So in Chomsky's eyes, power is this very nebulous thing. But power is largely captured by the ability of the ruling class to change how the other people in society think, right? And usually we call that ideology. And this ideology is really interesting, right? On some level, this ideology has to be the defining reality that the general people think about is actually truth, right? But for other people, this ideology is actually something very useful to serving their own ends. So that's all very abstract. Let's make it really, really concrete. There's a particular organization in Silicon Valley that has been responsible for creating an enormous set of ideology around what young people should be doing with their lives. You guys know what this organization might be?
Thiel?
Thiel? So the Thiel Foundation has been doing a good job of that. And my interactions with Thiel Foundation has been largely very positive. So I'd actually say that although they have been shaping a strong part of what young people should be doing with their lives, there's another one that's actually giving a sort of broader and also more negative message.
Baseball.
Facebook. Well, so this might shock you a little bit.
I see.
Right, and I agree with you, right? It's Y Combinator. So recently I was at a party, right? I met these two incredibly smart architect students that left university and started working on a 3D a 2D manipulation tool for 3D objects. Imagine you take an iPad, right? You use your fingers and you can manipulate a 3D object on the screen. And they were super excited about it. And I said, so what are you doing now? And they said, well, they looked at each other, had a long pause. Well, what do I see? And NYC, there was a lot of pressure to get metrics of users. And the tool that we created, although it was really cool and interesting, like we couldn't convert anyone to customers within the 3 months that we were there. And so there was a lot of pressure from the partners, and also from the other people. So we actually pivoted. We're actually working now. We're actually working now on a social network for couples. So we're helping two people connect to each other through their phones, right? And we're having a lot of trouble on getting virality. And I was like, no kidding. So YC is not a bad place, right? Programs essays are pretty intelligent, but if you read them without sort of critically thinking about why they exist, why YC exists, right? Then you might be led into a trap that traps so many young people that actually go to Wall Street about 20 years ago. Right? Why did people go to Wall Street 20 years ago? It's not really necessarily because they really believe in the financial markets as something interesting. They saw it as a place where if you went and you worked your butt off, right, you could make it rich, right? It was literally, it tapped into the raw visceral hunger of being young and wanting to like start a revolution, and like it gave you like a concrete career path. And in some sense, that is what's happening for entrepreneurship today, right? If you look at the evolution of entrepreneurship, before Y Combinator made it the cool thing to do, right? Entrepreneurship was something you did when you were completely crazy, right? When you worked for a company, right, the company gave you benefits, it gave you a good enough salary, and it also gave you coworkers who were hopefully not too sociopathic, right? It was like an organization that like slowly led people into economic productivity, right? And now everyone is wanting to be an entrepreneur. So what is the reality behind this, right? Going back to the water example, what is the water that we're drinking without knowing about it? So, most recently, there was an article published in Wired, 10,000 words, right? It is pretty long for anyone, whether short or BuzzFeed attention span, but it's really, really worth reading, right? And the URL of the article is really revealing. It says Wired / 2014 / publication date / no exit. And what is the article about? Well, literally, it is the personal stories of two founders as they try to navigate what YC has promised them to be a new promised land. Is actually, this like wasteland, right? So as I give you an example, on the right, this is a chart of venture capital funding over the last 4 years, right? The black lines are seed funding, so essentially anything below either $500 to $1 million, and then the yellow lines are Series A funding, $1 to $5 million. What this also means is this is the number of people who haven't prototyped, and they show someone, and someone says, oh, that seems like a promising prototype, you might be able to start a company, let me give you a tiny amount of money for it. And this other one is, wow, you actually have the beginnings of a company, let me give you more money so you can start to build that company for real. And what did you see? There's an exponential growth, like 3x growth in 3 years, right, of how much seed funding is being propagated in the valley. What does that mean? It means everyone with a prototype, an idea, is now being given money, real money, to say, go build the thing. But then, when they finish building it, only, half? This is like a little skewed plot, it's not entirely up to scale, but like half of them, potentially, might be funded for actual company. So the question is, what happens to the other guys? Well, this is a story of what happens to the other guys, right? And it's a pretty depressing story. So, here's a radical new thing. This claim is not original, it's made by other intelligent people, but I'm sort of like piecing together for you guys to think about. And the idea is that entrepreneurs are the new labor, right? So when the Industrial Revolution happened, people so what did jobs look like before Industrial Revolution, right? If you were a skilled artisan, if you made beautiful things that people used, right? You had this long mentorship process of learning how to make a pot, right? Interned with someone for 6 years to learn to make a pot, and then you set up your own shop and you employed 3 or 4 people and made pots, right? And each bot you sold for a pretty hefty sum because it took you a few years to make it. And then the assembly line came out, right? The assembly line took people who would have otherwise underwent long apprenticeships and turned them into commodities, right? So this gentleman standing, or this woman right here, making this box, right? If we were to take her from the factory and put it anywhere else on the floor of the factory, within 1 or 2 days she'd be doing exactly as well as anyone else in the factory. And this was a fundamental change of how valuable people were, right? Instead of being like an accumulation of like knowledge, right, and skill, these people were now being literally fungible units, right? And then all the labor history that we study about in history books is a response of people to that new commoditization in order to have a bargaining power to the people who run the factory, in order to be able to say, hey, your factory sucks, we need more working rights. A single person was no longer enough. We actually needed the entire factory floor to say, this is something we can't handle, and that was the beginning of labor unions. So why is that relevant for us? Well, in our day and age, right, what is a career path that many people are being encouraged to go into without necessarily all the correct training, right? Without all the pieces of the puzzle that will allow them to succeed, and with all the marketing that will essentially make them as commoditized as these labor workers. Founders. And I would actually distinguish here between two types of founders, right? There's technical founders and non-technical founders. And this case is true for both, but really especially true for non-technical co-founders, right? The sort of skills that you do as a non-technical co-founder are essentially business development and marketing, right? And those two skills are really fungible, right? Like anyone can essentially run Facebook ads, right? Anyone can sort of go into meetings and try to discuss like, what the deals and terms should be. But the critical missing pieces that really enabled non-technical co-founders to have like a seat at the table that really made them like a force to be reckoned with were stuff that you accumulate over the many years that you worked as a non-technical person, right? What does that really mean? That means like an intuitive, fundamental understanding of any industry that you want to do something valuable in, and a crap ton of political favors, right? This is something that's like completely de-emphasized, but as a non-technical co-founder, what you really are, like in some sense, is you're someone to whom other people owe unfair advantages to. Right? In order for you to succeed as a non-technical co-founder, you essentially need to be like Frank Underwood from House of Cards. Right? You need to make things happen and influence people in a way that fundamentally changes how your business is going to react to other businesses in the marketplace. So, going back to this theme, if the non-technical co-founders in Silicon Valley are the new labor, right? Who's building the factory? Right? Who are the factory owners in this new economy?
Facebook.
Venture capitalists.
Huh?
Venture capitalists.
Venture capitalists. I mean, those two answers combined are actually really, really good, right? In some sense, Facebook is the factory. No, sorry, wrong one. Y Combinator is the factory. Facebook are the people sort of buying what the factory is producing, right? So let's look again at the endorsements that Y Combinator has on their front page, right? Who do we have here? First one is a VP at Google, right? Similar to Facebook. He says this is the new model. Period. Full stop. Let's just say what the new model. This new model of what?
What?
Right? Second one, just today. Y Combinator is a big change in the way business is really done in tech circuits. Well, what kind of business are we doing here? Right? What is the business that we're really getting at? Fred Wilson from Ministry of Metrics. We love Y Combinator. Why does he love Y Combinator so much? Michael Energy, editor of TechCrunch. This is perfect. I love everything about Y Combinator. It captures the essence of Silicon Valley, right? So as a person, if you just read this in the beginning, you're like, wow, these smart people think Y Combinator is sorry, I'm gonna curse here. It's a shit, right? So we should all be going and trying to like see Y Combinator as the new badge of honor that we should accumulate. But then you look at everything I just said, like, well, these guys have vested interest in seeing Y Combinator as the new model, right? Y Combinator, for the people, let's go back to this graph. Y Combinator, for the people who are responsible for this sort of difference between seed funding and actual funding, Y Combinator is like a great, giant sand screen. I don't know if you've seen these things at construction sites. Right? You stick a screen that has metal grids on it, you take a lot of sand, you like throw it at the screen, and like a lot of sand gets stuck, and then some of the sand goes through. Right? Y Combinator is literally that screen. It takes founders and encourages them to go for really ambitious company ideas, and then most of them get stuck at the Series A crunch because everyone's like, wow, your idea didn't actually work out. I'm sorry. And then the ones that do, well, then Facebook, Google, and all these other places are like, oh, would you like a job at Google? Right? And this is actually the new R&D department for these big 5 tech companies. Right? Instead of having to hire engineers in-house and pay them 120K, 200K for 5 years to build something, you know, they allow 100 founders, right, distributed across either Silicon Valley or elsewhere in the country, to spend 3 years eating ramen noodles and taking 20K salaries, working on a thing, and if it succeeds, then they'll buy it, right? And everyone else, well, hard luck, man, your metrics didn't show up, so we're not going to actually fund you. That's a pretty depressing view of Silicon Valley, I have to admit, right? When I read these articles, when I put everything together, I was like, wow, this kind of really sucks, right? What does that mean for me, right? What does that mean for the people here at the Thiel Foundation who are, young, right? We're really hungry, and hopefully we want to make it like a not delusional dent in the universe, right? We want to sort of like see the world as it is and then try to figure out where in the world we can make a meaningful difference. So, this is almost the end of the first part of the speech, which is, first being able to perceive the environment around us. I'll wait for it to finish. Perceive the environment around us, right? Really understand the influences that we're getting every time we open TechCrunch. Really understand our motivations and how they're being changed and manipulated, right? And let me leave you with a positive note. So here's 2 companies started by people, under 25, who I think are actually going to avoid the trap, right? Avoid the sinkhole. The first is Clever. How many of you guys have heard of Clever before? Show of hands. 5, 6. So Clever is perhaps one of the fastest growing technology startups in education in the US today, right? As of today, I think there are more than 18,000 K-12 schools. 18,000, right? And the way that, ironically, it also came out of Y Combinator, right? But they had something that many of the other people going to Y Combinator didn't. And they had what I would call an informational advantage about a particular business problem. So, who started Clever? 3 guys from Harvard, right? 4 guy is a guy called Dan Carroll. He's really sweet, really sharp dude. But he did Teach for America for 2 years. And then, after Teach for America, he worked as an IT director at one of these K-12 schools, right? And he also did computer science in undergrad. But he saw firsthand the incredible waste that was being done in the schools, perpetrated, right? In his words, there was a crap ton of paper everywhere, right? That literally meant, as a teacher, you had to spend a lot of time filling out forms, and then a lot of time every time when your students transfer schools, filling out another set of forms, and basically, there was no good information management inside the company. Furthermore, he also was reading EdSurge. So EdSurge, for those of you guys in the ed space, is this, weekly publication of all the cool new apps that people are building for K-12 learning things are, right? And he wanted to use some of these because he was a new IT director at a school, and he found that 1, all the data in the school was completely disorganized, right? There were like 5, 6 databases, and 2, there was no good way to actually plug any of these things in together. So with that piece of knowledge, he went out to 2 friends, and they started Clever to build essentially an integrated data store, a uniform standard of data integration across all of the schools, right? And in the first summer that they went into Y Combinator, they signed up 1,000 schools, right? These are schools, right? These are like schools run by presidents that have principals that have no idea about technology, and yet they were able to scale really quickly to a lot of different people. And it wasn't necessarily because he was a good salesman. It was because he had literally been at the front lines of exactly the type of problem that needed to be solved, and then he went out and built a solution. So how's that different from all the other Y Combinator startups? Well, most people go on Y Combinator trying to design the next big social thing, right? And what that really means is that you don't have a good concrete understanding of who's going to use your thing, and 2, you don't have a really good feedback mechanism of like, are you going to be successful until you launch and then no one uses it. So let me briefly talk about Kensho. Kensho is currently not as successful as Clever, but it has the potential to be. And it's started by 2 guys. And again, I would argue that this is actually the prototypic formula for actually doing a significant startup today, right, as a young person. So Kensho was started by a guy who was working on his PhD on financial market signals, right? So he wanted to find different signals in the market that would correlate with increased returns on particular stocks. And in the course of that study, he interned at the Federal Reserve. And around the same time the Federal Reserve was interning, there was a few foreign policy crises So, overnight the Federal Reserve needed to respond quickly to essentially some world event somewhere, and they need to say either put out a